Imagine this: you're a child with no parents, no home, and no voice. You live in an orphanage, believing the adults around you are there to protect you, feed you, and maybe one day help you find a family. But instead, they lead you into a room where men in white coats are waiting, not with hugs, not with comfort, but with needles, pills, or strange machines. You are told nothing. You are given no choice. And your pain, your fear, your very life, is treated as nothing more than data. This isn't the plot of a horror movie. This is the hidden chapter of American history, the orphan experiments. In the mid-20th century, America was booming. Science and medicine were racing ahead: vaccines, new treatments, breakthroughs that promised to make life longer and healthier. But behind the shiny image of progress was an ugly truth. Much of that research came at the expense of the most vulnerable. And who was more vulnerable than children with no parents to fight for them? Orphans, kids in foster care, and children with disabilities were quietly used as human test subjects. Government agencies, prestigious universities, even respected hospitals, institutions people trusted, saw these children as expendable. They didn't need consent forms. They didn't need to explain. Who was going to complain? These kids had no one. Some of these experiments sound unbelievable today. In Massachusetts, at the Fernald State School, children were fed radioactive oatmeal as part of a so-called science club. Imagine being a boy, excited to be invited into something special, only to discover decades later you were being poisoned by radiation, just to study how your body absorbed calcium and iron. And Fernald was just one case. Across the country, orphanages became secret laboratories. Children were given injections, exposed to diseases, tested with dangerous drugs, all without permission. Their lives became numbers in medical journals. This is the dark side of America's obsession with progress. And it's a side that very few people talk about today. Because when the truth finally came out, the world was horrified, but by then, for many of those children, it was already too late. In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden history of these orphan experiments. We'll expose the scientists, the government programs, and the institutions that sacrificed children for the greater good. And we'll ask the question, how could this happen in America, the land of freedom and protection? Because if we don't talk about it, if we let it fade into silence, then the suffering of those children is erased. And history has a way of repeating itself when people forget. The first stop in this descent into horror is the Fernald State School in Massachusetts. From the outside, Fernald looked like a school for boys with special needs. But behind closed doors, it became one of the most infamous sites of unethical human experimentation. In the late 1940s and 1950s, scientists from MIT and Harvard teamed up with the US government to study the effects of radiation on the human body. But instead of adult volunteers, they chose children, poor boys with no families to defend them. The scientists created what they called a science club. It sounded innocent, even exciting. The boys were told they would get special privileges if they joined: trips to baseball games, fun activities, better food. What they didn't know was that the oatmeal they were being served was laced with radioactive isotopes. Yes, radioactive chemicals, hidden in breakfast cereal. These boys were never told the truth. They thought they were part of something special, while in reality, their bodies were being used as test tubes. The radiation was meant to track how nutrients like calcium and iron moved through their systems. Years later, when the truth came out, one man who had been a boy in that club said, "They were using us like lab rats, and we didn't even know it." But Fernald wasn't alone. Across the country, in New York, another nightmare unfolded at the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. This institution housed children with intellectual disabilities. Again, kids who had nobody to protect them. In the 1950s and 1960s, researchers at Willowbrook were obsessed with studying hepatitis. They wanted to understand how the disease spread and how it could be prevented. And their test subjects? Children at the school. Here's how it worked. Healthy kids were deliberately infected with hepatitis. Sometimes it was mixed into food, sometimes injected directly. The doctors claimed that these children were probably going to get hepatitis anyway, since the disease was common in the overcrowded institution. But instead of trying to protect them, they used their suffering as a medical experiment. Think about it, these were children, already struggling with disabilities, deliberately made sick so researchers could watch what happened to their livers. Some of them were left permanently damaged. Some of them never recovered. And still, the experiments continued. For years. Both Fernald and Willowbrick became infamous when the truth came out. But here's the most disturbing part, they were not isolated cases. They were part of a pattern, a belief that poor, orphaned, or disabled children were less valuable, and therefore could be sacrificed in the name of science. Radioactive oatmeal. Forced infections. Experiments without consent. These aren't just mistakes, they were deliberate choices. Choices made by respected scientists and approved by powerful institutions. And remember, these kids never had a voice. They didn't get to say, no, they didn't even know what was happening to them. To the world, they were invisible. If you thought radioactive oatmeal and forced hepatitis infections were bad, brace yourself. Because the US wasn't done using vulnerable children as human test subjects. By the 1960s and 70s, pharmaceutical companies had realized something chilling: orphanages were the perfect testing grounds for new drugs. Why? Because these kids had no parents to give, or refuse, consent. They were wards of the state. In other words, they belonged to no one. One of the most notorious cases came from New York City. At the Incarnation Children's Center in Manhattan, foster kids, many of them poor and African American, were enrolled in AIDS drug trials. This was during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 90s, when new medications were being rushed through testing. On paper, the trials were supposed to help sick children. But the reality was far darker. Many of the kids were given experimental drugs with brutal side effects. Some of them weren't even HIV positive, they were just used to see what would happen. Reports later showed that children who resisted taking the drugs were sometimes forcibly injected through feeding tubes. Imagine that, tiny kids, strapped down, medicine forced into their bodies. A BBC documentary later exposed this, interviewing former staff who admitted they knew the kids were being used like lab rats. Some children died. Others were left with lifelong health issues. And still, the pharmaceutical companies called it research. But New York wasn't the only place. Across America, other orphanages and foster care systems quietly became testing grounds. In some cases, kids were given experimental vaccines, not because they needed protection, but because scientists needed bodies to test on. And the cruel logic was always the same: they don't have families, nobody will complain. Think about that for a second. These were children, children who had already lost everything, children who deserved safety and love. Instead, they were handed over to labs and drug companies. It wasn't just AIDS drugs. In earlier decades, foster kids had been used for psychological experiments. Doctors tested powerful psychiatric drugs on children to observe behavioral changes. Some of these drugs would later be banned or tightly regulated because of their side effects, but only after kids had already paid the price. And in all of this, there's one disturbing truth: the government knew. These weren't rogue scientists acting in secret. Many of these experiments were approved, funded, or at least tolerated by federal agencies. The very institutions meant to protect children were the ones turning a blind eye. By now, a pattern is clear. Whether it was radiation, disease, or drugs, the children most likely to be targeted were always the most vulnerable: the poor, the disabled, the orphaned. Kids without voices. Kids society had thrown away. And the ugliest question lingers: if these scandals hadn't been exposed, how long would they have continued? For decades, these orphan experiments were buried in secrecy. Reports were classified, files hidden, and the victims, children, were too powerless to speak out. But eventually, the truth began to surface. One of the earliest cracks came in the 1970s, when investigative journalists began asking questions about strange medical trials conducted at state institutions. Survivors of the Fernald State School and Willowbrook State School started telling their stories. They spoke about radiation in their food, needles in their arms, and diseases deliberately given to them as kids. The public reaction? Outrage. People could not believe that in the United States, the so-called land of freedom and justice, children had been treated like disposable lab rats. Congressional hearings followed. In the mid-1970s, committees dragged scientists and government officials into the spotlight, demanding answers. At Willowbrook, the story hit national news. Geraldo Rivera, then a young reporter, filmed inside the overcrowded institution and exposed the horrifying conditions where children were both neglected and experimented on. His documentary shocked America and forced authorities to shut the place down. But even with these revelations, not everything came out. Some experiments stayed hidden for decades longer. It wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s that investigative journalists and independent researchers uncovered the full extent of the radiation and drug experiments. In New York, the AIDS drug trials on foster kids became public thanks to whistleblowers and activists. Families and advocates demanded accountability. The BBC documentary, Guinea Pig Kids, aired in 2004, igniting global outrage. Viewers around the world were horrified to see footage of little children being forced to take experimental medicine. And yet, even after exposure, justice was rare. Lawsuits were filed, yes, but many were dismissed. Courts ruled that the government and pharmaceutical companies were immune from certain types of liability. Survivors often received little more than apologies, if that. Still, the exposure mattered. It forced changes. By the late 20th century, stricter rules were introduced around human experimentation. Consent became legally required. Vulnerable groups like orphans and prisoners could no longer be targeted as easily. But here's the haunting truth: none of these rules can undo the suffering those children endured. None of the hearings, none of the documentaries, none of the outrage could give them back their stolen childhoods. And when survivors were finally given the chance to speak, many of them said the same thing: we were children. We trusted the adults. And they betrayed us. Think about that. The betrayal wasn't just scientific. It was moral. It was spiritual. It was a betrayal of the most basic human duty, to protect the innocent. So what does all this mean today? Why should we still care about experiments that happened decades ago? Because the legacy never really disappeared. The scars remain, in the survivors who still live with health problems, in the families who never got justice, and in the deep distrust many Americans feel toward government and medicine. And can you blame them? When people hear about new vaccines, new drugs, or government health programs, some immediately think back to the Tuskegee syphilis study, the radiation trials, the hepatitis experiments, and yes, the orphan drug trials. History has taught them one thing: sometimes the government lies. Sometimes the experts experiment first and apologize later. And here's the chilling part: the system that allowed these abuses hasn't completely vanished. Vulnerable populations still exist today: migrants, the homeless, foster children, prisoners. And as long as there are people with little power, there will always be a temptation to exploit them in the name of science. That's why remembering matters. If we forget, it can happen again. And many argue, in quieter ways, it already has. In recent years, questions have surfaced about pharmaceutical companies rushing trials overseas in poorer countries where oversight is weak. Some call it the modern version of the orphan experiments. Only now the orphans are children in Africa, India, or Latin America. But here's the key difference. Today, we know. We can't pretend ignorance. The stories of Willowbrick, Fernald, and the AIDS foster children are no longer buried in dusty files, they're right here, in front of us. And it's up to us, ordinary people, not just scientists or politicians, to hold power accountable. To ask the hard questions. To demand transparency. Because if we don't, history repeats itself. So next time you hear about a breakthrough drug or a government health program, remember the children who had no choice. The orphans who were told they mattered, but were treated as disposable. Their suffering isn't just a footnote in history, it's a warning. A warning that trust, once broken, takes generations to rebuild. A warning that the most vulnerable deserve protection, not exploitation. And a warning that if we forget these stories, they won't just stay in the past, they'll come back in the future. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just history. It's a mirror. A mirror showing us what happens when society decides some lives don't count. And maybe the scariest part. Those children never had a voice. But now, through us, through telling their story, they finally do.